How the Incas moved messages without wheels or writing. You are standing, figuratively of course, on a narrow path etched into the side of a mountain. The stone beneath your feet has been worn smooth by centuries of travelers. Above you, the sky is impossibly wide. Below, a valley drops away into a mist-laced canyon. There are no carts, no animals of burden, no roads in the sense the Romans might have recognized. And yet, messages move here. Fast, precisely. Daily. Welcome to the Inca Empire. And welcome to the Capac, the backbone of the Inca communication system. It is easy to overlook just how strange the Inca Empire was. At its height in the early 16th century, it stretched over 2,500 miles of mountainous terrain from modern-day Colombia to central Chile. But unlike most imperial networks of comparable size, the Incas never developed the wheel, nor did they use a written language. And yet, they managed to communicate fast, reliably, and across impossible terrain. Their solution? People, specifically. The Chasqui relay runners who formed the nervous system of the Inca state. These messengers did not carry scrolls. They carried memory. And they carried quipus, bundles of knotted strings that recorded numerical information through patterns of knots and colors. This system worked remarkably well. So, well in fact, that the Inca emperor, known as the Selpa Inca, could issue commands and receive reports from his far-flung provinces within days. Some historians estimate messages could travel 150 miles in a single day using this relay system. No. Postal wagons. No ink. Just feet, lungs, and memory. Imagine being a Chasqui. You are young, trained, and born to high altitudes. Your job is to wait at a tambo or relay station placed roughly every 6 to 9 miles along the Empire's roads. When you hear the signal, a conch shell, or perhaps a whistle, you leap to your feet, ready to receive the message. The runner appears, panting, sweating, with a pouch slung over his chest. He speaks quickly, perhaps a memorized oral message, or a set of numeric codes tied into a quipu. You nod, you repeat. You turn, and you run. Each segment is a sprint. No Chasqui runs for hours. That's not the point. It's speed, precision, and continuity. Modern Peru still remembers these runners. Oral traditions say they could cross entire provinces in a day. With no roads wide enough for carts, the footpaths they traveled formed a web connecting mountaintop cities and deep jungle outposts. The roads themselves were marvels. The Capacan, which means Royal Road in Quechua, was a system of more than 25,000 miles of trails, stairs, bridges, and paved paths. They weren't just built, they were maintained, inspected, and preserved. Much of the infrastructure survives to this day. In mountainous areas, roads became stone staircases. In jungle regions, they ran along ridges or across causeways, across rivers and ravines. The Incas built rope bridges using grass fibers, some stretching over 100 feet across deep chasms. It's easy to think of roads in terms of conquest or trade. For the Incas, they were communication lines. The pulse of a centralized state that had no wheels, no horses, no metal tools to speak of, but had control. Every 6 to 9 miles along the Capac stood tambo stations. These were not inns in the European sense. They were state-run facilities designed for administrative travel. Each tambo had food supplies, stored in ceramic jars or calcas, stone storehouses. They provided shelter, rest, and sometimes even fresh messengers. Most importantly, they acted as the relays for the Chasqui. Some tambos were small. Others, especially near Cusco or along royal routes, were elaborate compounds with guards, kitchens, and servants. And while these rest stops might seem mundane, they were the reason the message system worked. Without the tambos, no one could run 150 miles in a day. But with them, a message could move from the Pacific coast to the Andes in 72 hours. Here's where things get even more fascinating. Messages were carried in two forms, oral and knotted. The quipu system used strings made of cotton or camelid fiber, alpaca, llama. Each string contained a series of knots with the position, type, and spacing indicating numeric values, most often in a base 10 system. Some quipus even had color coding, possibly to denote categories like food, people, or taxes. A chasqui might carry a quipu and a memorized message explaining its contents, or he might simply pass it along to another messenger with instructions. The system required intense training. Chasqui had to be fit, but they also had to be smart. The wrong knot could change a census. A misremembered name could alter a law. And so, the Inca built something rare in the ancient world. A bureaucracy of memory. The silence of the Inca communication system is haunting. Imagine a state where nothing is written in books or etched in stone for legislation, where orders travel across mountains without ink. And yet, every tribute account, every census, every storage inventory, every seasonal calendar was delivered and recorded. All by memory, all by runners, all by hand-tied knots. And yet, we know so little of the content of these messages. Most quipus are undeciphered. The Spanish destroyed many. The rest remain as quiet witnesses of a society that measured and ruled with an almost alien logic. What kinds of things did the chasqui memorize? Could a runner carry both military orders and news of a family's birth? How are mistakes corrected in an empire without erasers? If the Inca runners could move so swiftly and remember so much, what did the Inca rulers do with that speed of thought? What decisions, imperial or intimate, traveled those stone roads? You can almost hear the footsteps if you listen long enough. The soft thump of rawhide sandals against mountain trails, rhythmic, persistent, and lonely. These were the steps of the chasqui, the messengers of the Inca Empire. In a civilization with neither wheels nor written script, the Inca carved order and efficiency out of the rugged chaos of the Andes, and they did it in no small part on the legs of young runners. In this second part, we now shift from the architecture of the system to the human engines that powered it. Chasqui were not chosen at random. They were selected, often from youth, based on physical strength, endurance, and loyalty to the state. Many came from humble backgrounds, peasant families from remote villages, yet to be a chasqui was no small honor. In the eyes of the Inca state, these boys were serving as extensions of the emperor's will. Training began early. Young chasqui were expected to run long distances in difficult terrain. Altitudes above 10,000 feet were common. The ability to carry a message without faltering, to relay it exactly, and to never deviate from the mission was instilled with almost monastic severity. But they were not running marathons exactly. The tambos, or relay stations, were placed at regular intervals, roughly every 6 to 9 kilometers, 4 to 6 miles, depending on the difficulty of the terrain. This ensured that no chasqui had to run a grueling ultramarathon. Still, even a few miles at high altitude, wearing only simple tunics and sandals, with precious cargo or memorized codes, was no small feat. These boys were trained in two key skills: running and remembering. The Inca had no alphabet, no books, no ink. So what did a chasqui carry? Two things: a quipu and a memory trained to precision. The quipu, also spelled quipu, was a bundle of knotted cords made from cotton or camelid fiber. Different colors, knots, and positions encoded information numbers, census data, tribute owed, troop movements, even ceremonial information. A chasqui might carry a quipu with encoded instructions and deliver it to a quipu reader, a kipakamak, at the next station or administrative center. The chasqui did not necessarily need to interpret the quipu. He needed to protect it. But sometimes, There was no Kipu-only spoken words. In these cases, memory was everything. Some Chasqui were trained in oral accuracy to an astonishing degree. A message might be repeated several times before departure, and the Chasqui would rehearse it, aloud as he ran. At the next relay station, he would pass the words on, verbatim. One slip could distort tax orders, troop movements, or divine decrees. The cost of error could be fatal, not just to the Chasqui, but to entire communities awaiting accurate instruction. There was no written proof of what had been said. Trust in the messenger's mind was absolute. Each tambo along the royal roads was more than just a pit stop. These were government-maintained relay stations, spaced in a network that rivaled even some Ramang standards. They offered shelter, food, and guards. And they weren't just for messengers. The tambos were also used to house officials, traveling administrators, tax collectors, and even soldiers. Some tambos were as large as small towns, with dozens of rooms, stores of supplies, and granaries. Others were tiny, humble shelters perched on lonely ridgelines. Every tambo had a designated message relay post. When a Chasqui approached, he blew into a putatu, a conch shell horn, signaling his arrival. The next runner, already dressed and waiting, would begin to sprint before the first had even come to a full stop. The transition was nearly seamless, one body slowing, another accelerating like passing a baton in a celestial race against time. At each tambo, fresh supplies were available. Coca leaves to chew for stamina and focus. Chich, a fermented maize drink, and hearty maize cakes. Injured Chasqui might rest for a day. Sick ones were replaced. But the mail such as it was never stopped. The entire network was so well coordinated that a message from Cusco to the distant city of Quito, over 2,000 kilometers away, could arrive in about 5 days. In the 1500s, without wheels, without ink, without beasts of burden, how did anyone know a boy sprinting out of the mist was actually a Chasqui? They wore distinctive clothing, often a tunic called an unku, marked with specific colors or patterns indicating imperial service. Some carried badges or specific Kipu symbols of authorization. Others wore headbands or sandals that were unique to state functionaries. Chasqui had the right to enter imperial property, approach nobles, interrupt commoners, and even demand assistance from locals under the Inca's Mida labor laws. If a messenger asked for food, water, or direction, to deny him was to deny the Sapa Inca himself. Still, being a Chasqui was not a pathway to fame or wealth. It was work, dangerous work, and often thankless. Imagine running a narrow mountain trail during the rainy season. You carry a knotted message meant for the general of an army. Below is a 2,000-foot drop. The path is slick, visibility is low, and you haven't eaten since the last tambo dot. The risks were many falls, predators, fatigue, hostile locals. And then there were the mountains themselves. The Andes, rising jagged into the sky, did not care if you were imperial. Weather could kill, and so could landslides. And then there were wars. The Inca Empire was not without enemies, even within its own borders. During revolts, Chasqui could be intercepted or killed to delay news or confuse chain of command. Some messengers, it said, were trained in basic combat defense, though this is debated. Most simply ran fast and hoped faster was enough despite their anonymity. Chasqui were not invisible to the culture they served. In Inca cosmology, messengers were seen as fulfilling sacred duty. After all, the Sapa Inca was considered a divine figure, a living descendant of Inti, the sun god. To carry his word was not just a civic duty, it was a cosmic responsibility. There are depictions of runners in art and oral tradition that survive even today, especially among Quechua communities who regard the Chasqui not just as a historical role, but as a symbol of endurance and communication. In fact, when the Spanish conquered the empire, the postal system fascinated them. The chronicler Pedro Cisa de Leon, who traveled through the Andes in the 1540s, marveled at how messages traveled so quickly. "It is a thing to be seen," he wrote, "to behold them run, and to consider the roads they use. Like a bird, the message flies from one end of the land to the other." Despite all this admiration, questions remain. Were messages always accurate? Was this system truly faster than horseback would have been had horses existed in the Andes? Did the lack of written redundancy doom the Inca to miscommunication in times of crisis? Some scholars believe the Chasqui system worked well for its time and needs, but would not have scaled further without major changes. Others argue that even with the limitations of terrain, the Inca demonstrated a startling mastery of logistical organization. Still others wonder how many voices were lost, because they couldn't run fast enough, remember well enough, or survive the night on those lonely roads. As we close this second chapter, we know more about the runners, their bodies, their tools, their world. But there's something missing still. What exactly did they carry? What kinds of messages shaped an empire, military, economic, personal? And what happened when the runners stopped? A runner dashes through a storm, soaked to the bone, a knotted cord clenched in one fist, and a set of words burning in his mind. His feet strike stone, dirt, and snow in rapid succession. Somewhere ahead, a general waits on the edge of rebellion. Somewhere behind, the voice of the Cepa Inca stretches thin across the Andes. This is not a story about speed alone. It is about power in transit, how the Inca wove control, religion, diplomacy, and war into a knotted thread and hurled it down mountainsides on the legs of boys. What exactly did the Chasqui carry? At the empire's heart was Cusco, navel of the world, as the Inca called it. From here, the divine Cepa Inca issued commands that had to be delivered to corners of an empire over 2,500 miles wide. The most critical messages were military orders. When rebellions erupted, or when campaigns expanded into new territories, the movement of troops had to be coordinated across immense distances and rough terrain. Messages included deployment commands, move troops to a specific location, supply, instructions, send maize, spears, tunics, reinforcement calls, casualty, and reconnaissance reports sent back to Cusco. It wasn't enough to send word once. Runners would form chains, ensuring updates moved both outward and inward, so that the emperor could respond to changes on the ground. In effect, the runners created a living nervous system for a body made of mountains. Another frequent subject of transmission. Tax and tribute records. The Inca ran an empire built on labor taxation, mita, and resource tribute. Every community was expected to contribute a certain number of workers, crops, textiles, or specialized goods to the empire. These contributions had to be tallied via quipu, scheduled for pickup or delivery, adjusted if droughts or shortages occurred. Messages might read, in quipu knots, 300 laborers from Alu X are due to work on the royal terraces in Ollantaytambo for the next moon cycle. A missed delivery could result in punishment, not just for the community, but for the local administrator who failed to report it. The Chasqui was the link that kept the gears grinding. Not all communication was logistical. The Inca priesthood also used the network for ritual synchronization. Religious festivals had to occur at specific times throughout the empire. Messages ensured that solar ceremonies, harvest rites, or ancestral offerings were conducted in accordance with divine timing. Runners might deliver instructions for sacrifices, calendric adjustments, portable ceremonial items like sacred coca or textiles, announcements of eclipses, omens, or celestial alignments. These messages were just as critical as troop deployments. An ill-timed festival was not just embarrassing, It was blasphemy. In an empire where the emperor was God's mouthpiece. Ritual errors were political errors. The Chasqui ensured the gods were obeyed. The Inca also ruled over a multi-ethnic empire. Not everyone spoke Quechua. Some resisted. Others collaborated. Diplomacy mattered. Messages sent to local lords, collaborators, or newly conquered regions could include invitations to imperial ceremonies, promises of titles or privileges, demands for loyalty oaths, warnings, or veiled threats. Some runners were likely entrusted with messages of sensitive nature, spoken directly to nobles in private. In these cases, Chasqui acted as couriers and emissaries, and sometimes they acted as spies. Though poorly documented, it's believed that some Chasqui carried coded oral messages meant only for certain ears. Because they moved so freely, they were also sources of intelligence reporting on regional mood, local shortages, or unrest. Their words could determine whether a general responded with gifts or spears. There's ongoing debate among scholars about whether Chasqui carried personal messages like letters between individuals or families. Given the scale of the system and the imperial focus, most historians believe the Chasqui were state couriers only. However, oral traditions and some Spanish accounts suggest that occasionally, nobles or administrators could send personal messages, especially between officials, in different provinces. These would likely be rare, reserved for the elite, and sanctioned by the state. It's also likely that villagers sent word-of-mouth messages via Chasqui, passing through an informal system, less official but deeply human. A whispered update about a son's marriage, a rumor from Cusco, a warning of sickness moving down the valley. Even in imperial systems, the human need to connect found cracks to slip through. When everything was working, the system dazzled observers. But when it failed, when a Chasqui was intercepted, or a tambo destroyed, or a quipu lost, things fell apart quickly. Revolts could spread faster than news of them. Disease could outpace medical aid. A single missed message might mean a supply caravan never arrives. Reinforcements miss the battle. A sacred ceremony is out of sync. Tax deadline is misread, causing accidental rebellion. This is the danger of high-trust, high-speed systems without redundancy. The Inca achieved precision, but not permanence. Still, the fact remains, they achieved it. Messages flew across mountain empires faster than most European systems of the same time. Without paper, without ink, without horses. Just memory, muscle, and the will of the state. After the Spanish conquest, the Chasqui system vanished almost overnight. The roads remained. Some tambos were reused, but the runners faded. Spanish chroniclers rarely mentioned their names. No Chasqui left memoirs. Their quipus became mysteries even the conquerors could not decode. The imperial voice went silent. The empire, once strung together by runners, dissolved into static. But if you climb the old roads today past llama herders and cloud-shadowed ruins, you may still find locals who remember old songs, old stories, of boys who ran like wind and never broke stride. The empire is gone. Its temples lie in ruin. Its golden idols long since melted into coins and chalices. The great Sapa Inca is no longer worshipped, and the quipus hang silent in museums unreadable, undeciphered. But the roads remain, twisting across ridges, descending into valleys, stone-paved and still firm beneath the feet. The Capac own, the royal road, refuses to vanish. Where the runners once flew, there are now barefoot children chasing goats, women with bundles, and hikers from distant lands. The legacy of the Inca runners, the Chasqui, has not disappeared. It has simply changed its pace. Let us now trace their footsteps into the modern world. At the heart of the Chasqui system was a logistical marvel, the Inca road network. Over 24,000 miles of interconnected highways, many built without iron tools or draft animals, cut across some of the most treacherous terrain on Earth. In many places, the Inca roads remain in use today. Farmers and traders in Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia walk these ancient paths daily. In rural regions where modern roads remain incomplete or impassable during the rainy season, the Capac endures as the most reliable route between towns. In 2014, UNESCO designated the Capac as a World Heritage Site, not as a static monument, but as a living cultural infrastructure, a road system that still binds together communities in the Andes. In essence, the runners' footprints are carved into the very geography of survival. Though the Chasqui themselves are no longer sprinting. Between tambos, their memory is kept alive in ceremony, pageantry, and oral tradition. In some Andean towns, especially near Cusco and Huancayo, festivals reenact the running of messages. Dressed in traditional tunics and carrying mock quipus, local youths perform symbolic relays during celebrations like Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun. In these symbolic races, the runners are not racing each other. They are racing the past. The goal is remembrance, not victory. Folk songs still mention the Chasqui often as symbols of loyalty, sacrifice, or youthful energy. Some songs lament the silence left by their absence. Others invoke them as messengers of the gods, now running. In the sky, these are not the grand epics of kings and wars. They are humble lullabies and rural ballads, history embedded in bedtime stories. Modern scholars, anthropologists, and indigenous groups continue the puzzle of the quipu, long dismissed by colonial chroniclers as primitive or undecipherable. The quipu has recently been re-evaluated as a sophisticated binary communication system. Research teams now believe that quipus may have included names encoded through thread color and not typed numerical, hierarchies for census and tribute, possibly even phonetic or narrative components. What was once dismissed as string art is now emerging as a potential written language, one that existed independently of the written traditions of Europe and Asia. For modern Andean communities, especially among the Quechua and Aymara peoples, the study of quipus is not just about archaeology. It's about reclaiming an intellectual heritage that was silenced by conquest. Some indigenous schools are now introducing students to replica quipus, not just as artifacts, but as tools for teaching history, mathematics, and identity. While there are no state-sanctioned Chasqui today, the spirit of long-distance endurance lives on in the Andes in curious ways. In the Cusco region, there are marathon events in which runners retrace portions of the Capac honoring the physical achievements of their ancestors. These races, ruling by modern standards, are still shorter than what many Chasqui once ran daily. In villages far from main roads, when trucks break down or bridges collapse, communities still turn to their fastest youth, often a teenager too. Deliver urgent news to the next town. No quipu is used. The message is memorized, just like before. And the legs that carry it are strong from climbing terraces and hauling water. So while the official title of Chasqui may no longer be in use, the function, the act of running between worlds, is still needed. The downfall of the Inca Empire was swift. Disease and conquest arrived hand in hand. In less than a generation, the system of runners vanished. What did they know that we have forgotten? How many messages were never delivered? How many quipus were burned? How many decisions about crops, wars, alliances were made based on runners arriving on time? And how many collapses began with a single misstep, a single lost breath on a cold mountain trail? When we study the Chasqui, we are not just studying a communication system. We are confronting a silenced intelligence, a mode of memory and transmission that thrived without ink or paper. It forces us to ask, what else have we mistaken for simplicity? What other systems have we overlooked, merely because they did not resemble our own? It is easy to admire stone temples and golden idols, but empires do not run on monuments. They run on messengers. The Inca runners boys with lungs full of tin, air and minds thick with meaning held in empire together not with armies, but with steps. Measured, rhythmic, enduring. Each tambo they passed became a breath. Each quipu they carried became a word. And together, their movement formed a sentence that lasted nearly a century. Though their voices are gone, the road still listens. And perhaps, if you walk it slowly enough, it might speak to you too. Story 2. The salt that built a kingdom. Life. Along the Trans-Saharan salt roads, you live in the desert. Not the soft kind with cacti and cowboys. This is the Sahara, a scorched, rippling ocean of sand. For months, the sun does not relent. The wind does not cool. Your tongue is cracked, and you sweat, if you are lucky enough to have any dries, before it can fall. And yet, in this place of endless thirst, there is one thing more precious than gold. Salt. In this first section, we step into the quiet yet essential world of the Trans-Saharan salt trade. It is a story without battles, without kings at first. It is the story of white crystals carried by black camels across brown sands, and how these crystals quietly carved cities into the dunes and laid the foundation for a kingdom. Mali. Salt. Seems unremarkable today. It is in your soup. It is in your sweat. It is sold in packets and thrown over fast food fries. But in the medieval Sahara, salt was not merely seasoning, it was preservation. It kept meat from rotting, fish from spoiling, and food edible through lean months. It was medicine, used to treat wounds and digestive issues. And for the desert traveler, it was a physiological necessity. Salt replenished what the sun stole. Without salt, you die. With salt, you trade, you store, you grow. In West Africa, where natural salt deposits were rare, salt was imported from the Sahara mined by hand from ancient beds of rock in places like Tagaza and Taudeni. From there, it was packed onto the backs of camels in slabs the size of coffins and marched for weeks across nothing but sand. Each slab could weigh 80 kilograms or more. And in many markets, that same slab of salt would be exchanged pound for gold dust. The Trans-Saharan trade did not begin with the salt trade, but salt gave it its shape. In prehistoric times, nomadic herders moved slowly across the Saharan Sahara, seeking water and grazing. But by the 8th and 9th centuries CE, a reliable trade route had emerged between North Africa, where Mediterranean goods and Islamic learning were abundant, and Sub-Saharan Africa, where gold, ivory, and enslaved people were found. Salt became the connector between these two worlds. North African Berber traders, especially the Tuareg, became the great navigators of the desert. Their camels, known as ships of the desert, could carry up to 200 kilograms and go a week without water. Entire caravans, sometimes made up of 1,000 camels or more, would wind their way from oasis to oasis, carrying salt southward and bringing gold, cola nuts, and slaves northward. The desert was unforgiving. Sandstorms could swallow men and animals. Oasis wells could run dry. And yet, every year, the salt caravans returned, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. If you had walked into Tagaza in the 14th century, you would have entered a city made entirely of salt blocks. Walls, buildings, storehouses, everything was built from the very substance being mined. Tagaza, located in modern-day Mali, was not a city of luxury. It was a work site, inhabited mostly by enslaved laborers and overseen by guards from desert tribes. There was no agriculture, no fresh water. Everything, food, wood, even drinking water had to be imported. And yet, Tagaza was essential. Salt was dug in trenches, lifted in slabs, and packed into camel trains bound for the south. Arab traveler Ibn Battuta who visited in the 1350s, described it as a village with no good in it, but essential to the empire's survival. Tagaza was, in essence, a mining colony, one that existed solely to feed the invisible arteries of the salt trade dot in the markets of cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and later Niani. Salt was not just traded, it was weighed, cut, and standardized. Imagine the transaction. A merchant from the north arrives with camels laden with salt. A local gold trader approaches with sacks of dust. They negotiate without a shared language, using silent trade rituals. One man lays out his goods, steps back. The other examines, leaves gold dust, and retreats. If the offer pleases, the first man takes the gold and leaves the salt. If not, he waits for more to be added. This silent barter was more than a cultural quirk. It was a method to build trust. In a world without shared laws, as this trade flourished, kingdoms rose around it. The Empire of Ghana, not to be confused with modern Ghana, and later the Empire of Mali, gained immense wealth and influence by controlling the flow of salt and gold. Taxes were levied at every point, at the mines, on the caravans, at the market stalls. In time, kings grew rich not by mining themselves, but by monopolizing movement. And so, the trade route of salt became a political artery. Whoever controlled. The salt controlled the bloodstream of West Africa. In 1352, the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta made the crossing from Sidi Massa in modern Morocco to Timbuktu. His account of the desert journey is one of the few eyewitness descriptions we have. He wrote of well-spaced days apart, sometimes dried-out camels dying mid-journey, their cargo lost to the sands traveled by night to escape the heat with stars. As guides in the silence so deep it could be heard, Battuta marveled at the discipline of the caravans and the enormity of the enterprise. He called the Sahara a sea without water, dangerous, trackless, yet absolutely vital to the empire's economy. When he finally reached the cities of Mali, he found granaries of salt, stacked like treasure, guarded like gold. This was not a land of extravagance, but of calculated abundance. Everything down to the ounce was measured and controlled. It is easy to romanticize gold. Gold glitters. Gold dazzles. Gold survives in crowns and coins and museum cases. Salt does not. It melts. It is consumed. It disappears into the body. And yet, for centuries, it was salt that moved kings, built cities, and fed empires. What does it mean that the most important things in history are often the ones that do not last? As we close this first section, consider this. In the middle of a continent-sized desert, a city made of salt once rose and fell. No photographs exist. No ruins remain. And yet, the world still turned because of what passed through its gates. What? Other empires, you wonder, have been held together by things that dissolve? A caravan approaches. It stretches for miles, camels in columns, slaves on foot, courtiers beneath awnings. Its passage is so slow it seems to take days to fully arrive, and when it finally stops, the earth is not richer for its rest. The earth is crushed under its weight. At its center rides a man whose name will echo through Cairo, Mecca, and Venice. A man who gave away so much gold that entire markets collapsed. A man made wealthy not by conquest, but by salt. His name was Mansa Musa, and he was the king of gold. But his throne? It was built on white dust mined from beneath a desert sun. The Mali Empire rose in the 13th century after the decline of Ghana and the warring of smaller kingdoms. Its founder, Sundiata Keita, unified the Mandinka people and forged a kingdom. Not on brute force, but on the control of trade routes, specifically the gold of the south and the salt of the north. By the time of Mansa Musa's reign in the early 14th century, Mali controlled the salt mines of Tidezave goldfields of Wangarave trade cities of Timbuktu, Gao, and Djenand. the rivers and roads that fed them all Mali was not just rich. It was structured. Merchants had rights. Markets had rules. Scribes kept records in Arabic script. And the king? He taxed everything that moved. The salt caravans were protected. The routes were policed. Trade was efficient, centralized, and enforced by a royal court that knew the value of invisible things. Mali's wealth was quiet until it wasn't done in 1324. Mansa Musa set off on the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca. He brought with him 60,000 men, 12,000 slaves, hundreds of camels, tens of thousands of pounds of gold. He passed through Cairo, and the stories say he spent so freely that he caused mass inflation. Gold became less valuable simply because so much of it appeared at once. Merchants wept. Markets crashed. And yet, the world finally asked, who is this man? Where is this kingdom that can waste gold? The answer, a kingdom fed by salt, grown fat. On the back of the desert trade. Timbuktu did not begin as a city of glory. It was once a seasonal camp, a meeting point near the Niger River where salt caravans met river traders. But under Mali's empire, it grew into a cosmopolitan hub of scholarship, commerce, and faith. It had 3 great mosques built from mud and dreams, dozens of madrasas, where Islamic law and science were taught, thousands of manuscripts written in Arabic, preserved in libraries, but it also had salt so much that slaned the walls of warehouses, and the price of gold fluctuated depending on how many camel trains arrived that month. Salt made Timbuktu not just smart, but solvent. It paid scholars. It fed guards. It bought ink and labor. Salt, not gold, was the everyday currency that you could not eat gold. But you could trade a pinch of salt for a bowl of millet. And so the city grew not just upward, but inward, building its foundations on practical things. Mali's greatness, like all greatness, was built on systems. A system of road guards and market inspectors, a system of taxation on trade goods, a system of trust, where salt moved through hundreds of hands, and every hand knew its worth, but it was also vulnerable. Salt routes were long, and exposed rivals sought to divert trade to their cities. New empires, like the Songhai, were rising, and when Mansa Musa died in 1337, the kingdom he left was heavy with gold, but light on heirs. Mali endured, but it no longer dazzled. The salt still came. The caravans still trudged. But the empire was already dissolving, like a crystal in rain. Salt made Mali, but it also marked its limits. You could not march salt into battle. You could not build loyalty from salt alone. You could tax it, but you could not make more of it. As ocean trade grew in the 15th century, and European ships began hugging the West African coast, the long camel routes across the Sahara began to shrink in importance. Timbuktu was still beautiful, but Forgotten to Gaza still mined salt, but with fewer guards, caravans still came, but fewer and farther between. And slowly, the desert began to reclaim what the empire had built. Today, the name Mansa Musa is a meme. He's called the richest man in history, his image painted in gold robes holding a nugget the size of a fist. But that image is incomplete, because for every coin he minted, there was a slab of salt behind it. For every palace, a caravan. For every market, a miner. And those miners did not live in palaces. They died with dust in their lungs, their hands cracked open by crystals. History remembers the gold. But history was built on salt. Salt can build kingdoms, but it can also outlive them. By the mid-15th century, the Trans-Saharan salt roads, once the arteries of the Mali Empire, began to fade from dominance. The world was changing, and with each slow shift, the salt that had built Mali's greatness began to lose its power. But this decline didn't come with fire or conquest. It came with wind, with boats, with silence, and the long forgetting. In the early days of the salt trade, The Saharan routes were marvels of endurance. Camels crossed over 1,000 miles of wasteland, guided by oral tradition, the position of stars, and the taste of the wind. Each stop along the route, each well, oasis, and way station was a matter of life and death. But after the 14th century, the balance shifted. Portuguese ships began hugging the West African coast-to-coastal trade posts, began siphoning wealth away. From the interior, newer routes, faster, cheaper, wetter undermined the camel's monopoly. The caravans still came, but fewer, smaller, more uncertain. The very salt slabs that once cost gold were now simply unnecessary for global trade. You could get salt from Europe, from the sea, even from newer inland mines that didn't require crossing a desert on foot, for 3 weeks straight. And so, the rhythm slowed. The sand, always patient, began to reclaim the path. Timbuktu had once been a city of light and learning, built on salt's currency. But it too was not immune to the winds of time dot by the 16th century. The Songhai Empire had taken control. Under Askia Mohammadi, Timbuktu saw a second golden age, but one more scholarly than commercial done. The great libraries continued to grow Islamic. Law was systematized science, and astronomy were studied in the mud-brick mosques, but trade? It was shrinking. And when the Moroccans invaded in 1591, using muskets and ambition, they shattered the city's defenses and burned its records. Timbuktu became a colony, a memory. The scholars still taught, but with fewer students. The salt still flowed, but without purpose. Once a hub, the city was now a shelf, beautiful but still. Far north, in the Tagaza salt mines, the work never really stopped. The slabs were still pulled from the desert floor, still stacked like bricks, still loaded onto camels, but without an empire to sell them, the value declined. Tagaza was always brutal. Miners lived in salt block huts. They drank water hauled in from over 100 kilometers away. Food was scarce and disease frequent. The air was so dry it burned the nose, and yet they worked. Even as prices fell, even as caravans stopped coming, even as the world forgot them. Today, the ruins of Tagaza are their still salt walls crumbling under sun, mute to the centuries they once served. No glory, no plaques, just salt. Why did salt lose its throne? Because power is not just about what people want. It's about how. They get it done with the rise of Atlantic maritime empires. The entire framework of African trade began to pivot. The Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch later joined by the British and French established deep water ports, trading directly for African goods, bypassing the long internal routes. They wanted slaves, ivory, gold, and spices, not salt. They could boil their own brine, mine their own reserves, build their own systems. Salt, once a scarce lifeline, was now simply another commodity. And in that shift, empires crumbled. Mali fragmented, Songhai fractured. The old trading alliances faded, replaced by coastal kingdoms, port cities, and European forts. But even after its fall from economic dominance, salt remained culturally powerful. In many Sahelian communities, salt still appears in bride. Price negotiations, salt slabs are still buried with elder salt. Is still offered to guests as a sign of respect and preservation. And even today, some Tuareg caravans still make the long journey to the mines of Taudeni, carrying on a 1,000-year-old tradition, more ritual than necessity, more symbol than economy. The road is hard, the desert unforgiving. But the journey is a story, and in making it, they keep that story alive. Not because the world needs the salt, but because they do. In the end, salt teaches us the truth about historical importance. Empires are often remembered for their gold, for wealth, war, and pageantry. But beneath every gold coin is a grittier story, a story of labor, monotony, infrastructure, and systems that held it all together. Salt is infrastructure. It is survival. It is monotony. It is boring. And that's why it matters. Because without it, no kingdom could last. No people could thrive. No history could continue. We remember Mansa Musa's pilgrimage because he gave away gold. But he could only give because behind him, a system of salt had made it possible. Every camel, every miner, every dry-throated merchant who gave up years of his life for a single slab of crystalline dust dot. So when we think of history, we must also think of the invisible traits, the unglamorous systems, the commodities that never sparkle but never run out. Salt did not vanish. It simply became part of the foundation beneath our feet. Water is boring. Until you don't have it, then it becomes everything: the weight of a kingdom, the shape of an empire, the difference between prosperity and collapse in the blistering heartlands of ancient Persia, where the rivers were wide but the deserts wider. A canal was dug not for glory, not for conquest, but for the slow survival of daily life. This was the Narawan Canal, a marvel of ancient engineering almost no one remembers, and yet it fed a city. It watered fields. It helped keep the Abbasid Caliphate alive for centuries. And it all began with a ditch dot. To understand the Narawan Canal, you must first understand Iraq before oil, a region known as Mesopotamia, or the land between the rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates, two lifelines winding through the dust. But rivers, while plentiful, were also chaotic. They flooded unpredictably, dried out seasonally, and didn't always flow where the people were. Early rulers faced a problem. How do you force a river to serve an empire? You dig dot and dig, and dig, until the water flows where you want it dot. Thus, the tradition of irrigation in Mesopotamia predates even the wheel. But the Narawan Canal was something more. The earliest version of what would become the Narawan Canal was dug in the Sasanian period, possibly as early as the 5th century CE, under the reign of King Khosrow. Khosrow wasn't building for beauty. He was building for power. His capital, Ctesiphon, was growing. His people needed food. His army needed supplies. His scribes and scholars needed stability. The Tigris could flood. The Diyala River was unreliable. So they connected the rivers. And from that, Narawan was born. A canal nearly 300 kilometers long, built by hand, with pickaxe and laborers under the whip of a system more rigid than stone. But the reward? Fertile fields, year-round crops, and an entire province that could feed itself. The Narawan Canal didn't conquer lands. It didn't feature in heroic epics or coinage. It just and that. In ancient governance, was miraculous. It reduced famine. It kept tax revenue steady. It allowed centralized government to plan for growth. Every village connected to the Narawan system had its life synchronized to water. Fields were irrigated on a schedule. Ditches were cleared. Communal leaders measured flow, and enforced use water rights were allocated by decree. It was bureaucracy before bureaucracy had a name. And it showed one of history's oldest truths. A great ruler may build palaces. But a wise one builds irrigation. When the Islamic Caliphate took over the region in the 7th century, the Narawan system wasn't torn down. It was expanded. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in the newly founded city of Baghdad in 762 CE. The Narawan Canal became part of a pan-imperial water strategy. Crops from the canal-fed lands flowed into Baghdad's markets. The canal served as a secondary transport artery during the dry season. Urban planners used it to feed city fountains, bathhouses, and gardens. In short, this one dusty trench helped feed what was then the most sophisticated city on earth. Poets and philosophers walked on streets fed by barley and rice grown in the Narawan plain. And no one ever wrote a single poem about the engineers who made it possible. It's easy to dig a canal once. It's harder to keep it alive. The Narawan Canal was constantly under threat. Silt buildup required annual dredging, unauthorized ditches, siphoned off water. Nomadic groups occasionally sabotaged the flow as leverage. In years of war, the canal fell into partial disrepair. Abbasid bureaucracy developed entire departments just to oversee canal inspectors, who in turn oversaw local governors, who in turn monitored farmers. It was exactly as boring as it sounds. But it worked, and it reveals something critical. Empires don't fall because they are weak. They fall when the boring parts stop working. By the 11th century, the system began to fray. The Abbasids were in decline. Local governors no longer feared central authority. Canals were diverted for local projects. Water was hoarded. Fields dried. Food became scarce. Then came the Mongols. In 1258 CE, Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad. But what many forget is that his army didn't just burn libraries. They destroyed the canal system. Deliberately. Strategically. They understood what many didn't. If you break the irrigation, you break the empire. By the 14th century, most of the Narawan Canal lay dry and choked with sand. Not because the desert won, but because the systems that fed it collapsed from within. Today, the ruins of the Narawan Canal are hard to find. Satellite imagery reveals ghostly etchings across Iraq's soil lines, where water once moved, where crops once grew, where cities once depended on a quiet, unglamorous miracle. There are proposals, occasionally, to restore parts of it. But funding is scarce. Records are incomplete. And modern irrigation, for better or worse, prefers pumps and pipes. So the Narawan remains mostly a memory, not a ruin, but a forgotten infrastructure. The kind of history no one builds statues for. And yet, as climate change reshapes our world, as water becomes again a source of conflict and necessity, one must wonder, in the ruins of the Narawan Canal. Do we see the past's failure, or a blueprint for the future? The science of ancient water. It's easy to dismiss ancient infrastructure as primitive mud canals, stone shovels, wooden gates. But the truth is more surprising. Ancient Persian hydrology was advanced. The engineers of the Narawan weren't just diggers. They were planners, surveyors, and data analysts armed with tools of geometry, astronomy, and centuries of observation. They calculated slope gradients by sight. Sediment basins to trap silt-built sluices and regulators to control seasonal flows. Created secondary canals to feed outlying farms, designed overflow systems to prevent flood damage, and all this without a calculator. The Narawan system was essentially a hydraulic civilization, one that thought with water first and built its calendar, economy, and governance around it. It's a quiet genius we still underestimate. The canal wasn't a lonely trench. It was a network, a web of water arteries that carried more than just moisture. It carried social control. Farmers who used water without permission could be fined or imprisoned. Water schedules were enforced by appointed canal inspectors known as Amiens. Disputes over irrigation could go to court, and sometimes did. The state maintained detailed water registries, listing landowners, use rights, and seasonal allocations. It was, in every way, a state within a state, an empire of mud, ruled not by kings, but by engineers and clerks. The Abbasid Caliphate wasn't perfect, but it had one essential insight. Power isn't always about armies. Sometimes it's about timing the barley harvest. They invested in maintenance. They created schools that trained administrators in canal management. They wrote books on water law, many of which survived into the Ottoman era. Baghdad's golden age wasn't built on gold. It was built on grain, and grain grew in Narawan's shadow. And yet, despite its importance, few chroniclers wrote about the canal, because when it worked, it was invisible. Like the blood in your veins. So what killed it? Not just the Mongols. They only ended what centuries of neglect and decentralization. had begun. By the 12th century, corruption meant inspectors could be bribed local governors. Diverted water for private estates. Small farmers were squeezed by rising taxation. Maintenance became infrequent. Droughts went unaddressed. The canal, once so reliable, began to fail silently. Crops wilted. People migrated. Baghdad's food supply strained. A water empire doesn't die with a bang. It dies with a trickle, then a cough, then a silence. Today, we're obsessed with mega projects, dams, pipelines, desalination plants. But we rarely ask the most important question. What happens after you build it? Because the Narawan Canal teaches us that the hard part isn't construction. It's maintenance. It's governance. It's trust. A canal doesn't work if farmers don't cooperate. It doesn't work if officials don't inspect it. It doesn't work if people steal from it. It doesn't work if no one believes it matters. It doesn't work if people steal from it. It doesn't work if no one believes it matters. The canal didn't collapse because of one bad decision. It collapsed because 1,000 small ones added up over time. You'll find similar stories across the world. The collapse of the Mayan aquifers, the silted canals of Angkor Wat, the broken stepwells of medieval Gujarat, the abandoned Roman aqueducts. Across the Mediterranean, water systems are the bones of civilization. But when they rot, the skin collapses. Narawan is just one grave in a long cemetery of hydraulic empires. There's a quiet irony in history. The people who build wars are remembered. The ones who build water are forgotten. And yet, ask any empire that has lasted. They did not rise by the sword alone. They rose by feeding people, and that meant irrigation. So why don't we study these canals more? Because they're too quiet. They don't fit into grand narratives. There are no battles, no heroes, no monuments, just mud, wood, labor, and time. But without them, nothing else functions. Drive east of Baghdad today, and you'll pass dry riverbeds, forgotten farms, crumbled bridges. But look closely, you might see a trench half filled with earth, still straight as a ruler, cutting across the plain. That was Nahran. And if you follow it, if you listen to the wind where water once ran, you might hear what the empire forgot. Civilization is not a monument. It is a channel. And if we do not maintain it, it dries. The ghost in the floodplain, the Narawan Canal, is dry now. You can walk its bed in silence, brushing aside weeds and rusted tin. Birds will call in the reeds, and sometimes goats follow the old banks, ignorant of the fact that they tread through the ruins of a lost artery. There are no signs, no plaques, no fences. Only the land remembers. Yet, its ghost lingers, not in stone, but in practice. Because what the Persians, Sassanids, and Abbasids built wasn't just a canal. It was an idea that water must be moved, shared, measured, and trusted. And long after the last flood passed through Narawan, this idea seeped into new lands quietly, subtly into law codes, agriculture, engineering, and even into the quiet corners of modern city planning. You might think this story ends in Iraq, but parts of Narawan live on quietly, like scattered seeds. The Abbasid approach to water scheduling influenced Islamic legal traditions, particularly fiqh jurisprudence around common resources. The Andalusian cities of Cordoba and Seville adapted irrigation techniques brought by engineers trained under systems inspired by the Abbasid model. In parts of North Africa, Qanats and Falai systems still use methods of flow management, eerily similar to Narawan's downstream regulators. Spanish Muslim agriculturalists carried this water knowledge into Moorish Spain, which in turn influenced early European hydraulic planning. Even today, in parts of Iran and Iraq, you'll find communities whose seasonal planning calendars still reflect echoes of ancient irrigation rhythms. The patterns of sowing barley, rotating crops, and leaving land fallow every third season all have roots in systems like Nahran. It's a hydraulic inheritance. passed invisibly. You likely know the names of conquerors: Genghis Khan, Julius, Caesar, Napoleon. But can you name the man who first measured the fall rate of the Narawan? Of course not. No one recorded him. No epic poem was written about his work in surveying gradients, aligning canals with seasonal rain patterns, or calculating how much silt to remove each year from the main channel. But he existed. And he mattered. Because without him, the kings starve. Civilizations rarely die because they lost a war. They die because their logistics failed. They die when they forget the engineers. Modern states still struggle with water. California fights over aquifers and rivers like ancient Mesopotamian city-states once did. The Nile's flow is now the focus of political tension between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. In parts of Asia, overbuilt canals have turned fields into salinated deserts. Droughts have brought back questions our ancestors solved thousands of years ago, just without the engineers who originally solved them. It seems almost embarrassing that after millennia of advancement, we still forget the basic truth. Civilization is only as strong as the water it can move predictably. And the first thing to break quietly, without fanfare, is often the canal. In textbooks, the Narawan gets a paragraph, maybe two. More space is usually given to the Mongol siege of Baghdad, because fire and ruin make for more exciting reading than bureaucratic maintenance logs. But for every story of destruction, there are centuries of function, quiet labor, quiet cooperation. A farmer opening a gate at dawn, a clerk marking a harvest projection, a laborer dredging silt from the main channel, a dispute solved before it became a feud. These are not cinematic moments. They are moments of continuity. And continuity is what keeps civilizations alive. The Narawan Canal was not about genius. It was about consistency. If there's one thing the Narawan truly teaches, it's this: water isn't just about physical infrastructure. It's about social infrastructure. A working canal assumes that you trust your neighbor not to take more than their share, that the inspector shows up on time, that the tax used for dredging isn't stolen, that someone will fix the leak before the field dries out. Remove any one of these assumptions, and the system collapses. In this way, the Narawan was a philosophy of society: cooperative, cyclic, patient, structured, bureaucratic, and a little dull, but it worked. For over 1,000 years, it worked. If you're listening to this at night, trying to fall asleep, maybe you're now picturing a quiet stretch of land outside Baghdad. Long ago, you might imagine a line of men walking along the embankment, spades on their shoulders, the soft scrape of wood against silt, the creak of a sluice gate opening before dawn water trickling slowly, predictably, through a carefully measured trench. No armies, no speeches, just water and time. And maybe you'll realize history isn't always a storm. Sometimes it's a canal, dug slowly, filled carefully, and forgotten too soon. Why do we let such systems fail? We know what causes collapse: neglect, a rupture, Shinto storm, thinking, and yet, even with centuries of warning, we continue repeating the same hydrological sins. The ruins of Narawan do not ask us to weep. They ask us to look ahead. So tonight, as the noise of modern life dims, and the idea of a 1,000-year-old canal seeps into your thoughts, ask yourself, what systems today are quietly dying beneath our feet? And will anyone even notice until it's too late? Story 4. The bureaucrat who saved Rome. Frontinus and the aqueducts. Rome was not built in a day. But if you listen closely, you'll find that Rome was not really built by emperors, generals, or philosophers. Not fully. Because under the marble forms, behind the military triumphs, and beneath the daily bread and wine, there was one essential, often invisible force: colon water. Not just water in jars, not puddles or streams, but structured, engineered, legally distributed water. And this story isn't really about emperors. This story begins with a man you've probably never heard of, Sextus Julius Frontinus. Not a gladiator, not a poet. A bureaucrat. His job? Ensure that Rome, a city of over 1 million people, did not die of thirst. The inconvenient greatness of Rome in the 1st century CE. Rome had a problem. It had grown too large for its natural geography. The Tiber River was muddy, unreliable, and often dangerous during floods. Wells were inconsistent. Rainwater catchments helped, but they couldn't possibly support the full weight of an imperial city. Rome was, simply put, thirsty. And the solution had already been in place. Aqueducts. By the time Frontinus appeared on the scene in 97 CE, Rome already had 9 aqueducts feeding it water, some stretching nearly 60 miles in length, winding through hills, tunneling under mountains, and marching over valleys on massive stone arches. Water came from springs as far as 50 miles outside the city. It traveled day and night. But here's the thing. No one really knew where all of it went. The man called in to count the water when Emperor Nerva appointed Frontinus as the curator aquarum, the supervisor of aqueducts. He didn't get a ceremonial sword or a marble bust. He got a set of keys, a team of engineers, and a job description that looked like this. Inspect all the aqueducts, calculate daily water flow, discover and stop illegal diversions, repair failing infrastructure, create a record of the entire system. In short, make sure Rome didn't run dry. Frontinus was already a man of experience. He had served as governor of Britain, a consul, and a general. But this was arguably the most important and least glorious post he ever held, and he took it seriously. Where water went and didn't. What Frontinus discovered was deeply wrong in its inefficiency. Records were incomplete or contradictory. Pipes had been tampered with. Elites had diverted channels illegally. And the physical infrastructure itself, pipes, tunnels, arches, was eroding under neglect. He realized something crucial. The system had grown so large that no one actually knew how it functioned anymore. So he started walking. A bureaucrat with a foot in the mud. Frontinus was not an armchair administrator. He physically toured the aqueducts. He measured flow rates. He took notes, made charts, and recorded how water entered and left the city. He was methodical. Water was divided into categories: public use, imperial use, and private allocations. Public water included baths, fountains, and some latrines. Imperial water went to palaces, gardens, and large official structures. Private water was often granted by special decree, sometimes in writing, sometimes simply understood, and often exploited. Frontinus started quantifying this in real numbers, writing. One of the earliest known examples of public water auditing in history. And in doing so, he documented the first major instance of urban water management centuries before modern cities considered flow regulation. Infrastructure as policy, one of Frontinus's breakthroughs, was recognizing water as a tool of governance. He wasn't just thinking about plumbing. He asked bigger questions. Who controls access? What does fair distribution mean? How do we penalize those who cheat the system? Can we legislate against water theft? Under his administration, Rome instituted stronger rules about pipe tapping, standardized pipe materials, and even sent inspectors into neighborhoods to identify illegal usage. He understood something that few did at the time. Water wasn't just about need. It was about trust. And trust required transparency and maintenance. More than stone arches, we often think of Roman aqueducts as beautiful ruins, arched structures cutting across green valleys. But most aqueducts were invisible. Of the 9 functioning systems in Frontinus's time, most were underground. These were low maintenance, protected from sabotage and erosion. and provided a constant pressure-fed flow into the city. The famous arches you see today? They were the minority used only when geography demanded it. This mattered to Frontinus, because infrastructure had to serve function first. Beauty came second. Gravity, slope, and the Roman eye. Here's the part that many forget. The Romans had no electric pumps, no sensors, no laser tools. Everything flowed by gravity. And the system worked. The slope of an aqueduct could not be too steep, or water would rush too fast and damage pipes. But too shallow, and the flow would slow, stagnate, or back up. The average slope? 1 in 2,000, meaning for every 2,000 feet, the water dropped just 1 foot. And Roman engineers did this by eye, using simple tools like the corrubates, a 20-foot leveling tool with water channels, the dioptra, an early sighting instrument plumb, bobs, string, and sheer instinct. Frontinus documented all of this, preserving it not as invention, but as standard practice. Why water mattered more than golds? So why did this all matter? Because Rome's most basic needs, food, hygiene, and public order, depended on water. Bread production required milling, which required water-powered mills. Public baths, used by thousands daily, needed thousands of gallons per hour. Fountains ensured public hydration. Sewers, surprisingly advanced for their time, depended on water for flushing waste downstream. Without aqueducts, Rome would have collapsed under its own population. Without someone to manage the aqueducts, the collapse would have come even faster. And this is why Frontinus matters. Not a hero, but a steward. Frontinus didn't win wars. He didn't inspire poetry. He didn't conquer Gaul. He counted. He checked. He remeasured and repaired. He made sure that people bathed, drank, and flushed in peace. And yet his work, perhaps more than any soldier's, kept Rome alive. In his treatise, De Aqueductu Urbis Romi, on the water supply of Rome, he left behind the most detailed account we have of ancient infrastructure management. It's dry, it's procedural, it's full of pipe diameters and valve placements, but it is the story of civilization continuing. And still, a question as you sit quietly now, listening to the gentle droning rhythm of aqueducts, arches, and measurements. Imagine walking with Frontinus through a stone channel, torch in hand, the slow trickle of water echoing off limestone walls. Imagine asking him, "What's the hardest part of your job?" Would he say the measurements? No. It's likely he'd say, "The hardest part is making people care before it's too late." Because water doesn't scream. It just stops. The aqueducts of Rome were not just stone conduits of water. They were arteries in the body of the empire, delicate, precise, and vulnerable. And Sextus Julius Frontinus, the quiet bureaucrat, was determined to give them a full checkup. But a system as complex as Rome's water supply was not just technical, it was deeply political. And as Frontinus set about mapping, measuring, and restoring, he was stepping into a maze of power, privilege, and quietly festering corruption. Let's return to the year 97 CE. Rome was at the height of its imperial elegance. Its streets buzzed with carts, arguments, hawkers, and senators. Marble gleamed, statues loomed, and fountains gurgled continuously. But behind many of those flowing fountains was an illegal tap, and Frontinus had had enough. Not all water was equal to understand the problem. You need to understand how Rome viewed water. Water had categories. Frontinus, ever methodical, listed them. Aqua publica, water intended for public use, like baths, fountains, and latrines. Aqua privata, water granted to individuals or private estates, sometimes by decree, sometimes by bribe. Aqua caesaris, water reserved for imperial properties, palaces, and privileged gardens. Aqua for special use, water provided for temples, theaters, or specific municipal needs. Each stream of water had its intended destination. But over time, many of those streams had been redirected, sometimes by clever engineering, other times by brute force. Roman elites had tapped public lines to irrigate their gardens, fill their private baths, or cool their summer villas. And most shockingly, some didn't even hide it. Illegal pipes. Invisible Power Frontinus began uncovering illegal taps pipes inserted into public aqueducts, often deep within tunnels or near inspection hatches. Some were small, cleverly disguised. Others were audacious. Entire villa complexes, drawing off thousands of gallons a day. And these weren't poor people stealing a bucket. They were senators. The wealthy had long operated under the assumption that water, like power, was theirs by right. They employed teams of workers to install unauthorized taps, bury pipes under walls, and silence curious inspectors. Some even installed their own cisterns, reservoirs of stolen public water feeding, vast fountains in private courtyards. Frontinus wasn't just discovering technical violations. He was discovering a philosophy that the city's most basic needs could be diverted if you had enough marble on your walls. Audit as weapon to confront this. Frontinus leaned into his strongest weapon, paperwork. He began a full audit of Rome's water supply. Every aqueduct was measured both in length and in gradient. Every cistern, tank, and fountain was cataloged. Every legal grant of water, called a diploma, was re-examined. Every unauthorized use was reported by name. He didn't just identify problems. He documented them with precision. He compiled lists of illegal users, exact pipe widths measured in quinaria, a Roman unit, and calculated the approximate stolen volume. For instance, one illegal pipe might be 5 quinaria wide. If water flowed for 12 hours a day, he could calculate exactly how many cubic meters were diverted from the public. He turned water theft into math. And then he named names. Frontinus took a bold step. He published some of these findings. In his Treatise de Aqueductu, he criticized both individuals and systemic failures by name. This was not merely administrative. It was political. Calling out high-ranking citizens could result in backlash, loss of favor, or worse. But Frontinus believed in the rule of law. And more than that, he believed in fairness of access. He made it clear that Rome's survival depended on more than status. It depended on function, and function demanded discipline, flow to infrastructure. But Frontinus didn't stop at auditing. He pushed for repair. Much of the infrastructure had quietly decayed. Limescale built up in channels, reducing flow. Earthquakes had shifted stone linings. Roots penetrated brickwork. Tunnels collapsed silently in hills far from the city. Frontinus issued work orders, allocated labor, and organized teams of slaves, engineers, and soldiers to clear, dig, and reconstruct. Under his direction, the Aqua Marcia, Rome's longest aqueduct, was fully cleared and reinforced. Breaks in the Aqua Appia, the oldest, were restored with newer concrete linings. The Aqua Claudia, known for its majestic arches, was repaired at its damaged source point in the hills. He wasn't just fixing pipes. He was reviving the veins of an empire, the workforce. Behind the water, we often forget the human hands behind infrastructure. Frontinus relied on a quarry, water technicians responsible for valves and flow, structors, masons who repaired channels and arches, custodies, guards who monitored public water sources. Mensors, measurers who confirmed pipe widths and flow pressure, library, clerks who documented daily readings. These people, mostly slaves or low-status freemen, maintained a system that served emperors and commoners alike. Frontinus treated them not as expendable labor, but as professionals. He even recommended better training and clear hierarchy, an early nod towards civil engineering as a field of expertise. No pumps, no pressure, Still success one of the marvels of the Roman system, and one Frontinus proudly documented, was its simplicity. With no pumps, they achieved constant flow to high elevation fountains using inverted siphons, internal pressure regulation, using settling tanks. Water delivery across 60 miles with just 1% average gradient, redundant aqueducts feeding the same districts for resilience. Frontinus appreciated this genius, not as romantic ruin, but as usable design. He frequently reminded readers that the ancients did not aim for magnificence, but usefulness. That, he thought, was Rome's greatest gift. Water as civic identity to Frontinus. Water wasn't just about hydration or hygiene. It was civic glue. Bathhouses were not merely places to clean. They were places to socialize, debate and transact. Fountains were not luxuries, they were community anchors. Even public latrines served as equalizers, free to all, regardless of status. By restoring water access, Frontinus was restoring Roman identity, because Rome, for all its marble, measured itself by what it could provide cleanly, reliably, and equally. The power of knowing what Frontinus gave Rome, more than repairs, was knowledge. He knew where every pipe went. He knew who was stealing. He knew what volumes flowed on which days. And in writing it all down, in prose dry enough to induce yawns even then, he handed Rome a tool it didn't know it needed. Administrative memory. He gave future curators a map, a methodology, and a mindset. Maintain the flow. Count the flow. Guard the flow. Because when water is unaccounted for, society dries up. A whisper of doubt, but even as Frontinus enforced reforms, issued fines, and published findings, he knew something else. Power rarely likes to be measured. By naming names and enforcing rules. He made enemies. By restoring transparency. He disrupted private empires of privilege. And he wondered, could it last? Could rules survive beyond the man who enforced them? Would the next curator care? Or would the pipes quietly be tapped again, and the water Rome's lifeblood fade back into elite hands? By the time Sextus Julius Frontinus handed over his duties as curator aquarum, the official in charge of Rome's water supply, he had already done something few Roman officials ever achieved. He had written himself into the masonry of the city, not with statues, not with battles won, but with flowcharts, inspection points, and maintenance logs. And when he stepped down, there was no grand ceremony, no golden plaque, no temple. Instead, his final words in De Aqueductu reveal a man who valued method over memory. I have recorded these things so that my successors will not have to discover them anew. That simple phrase may seem unremarkable, but in the layered bureaucracy of ancient Rome, it was a radical act, because most bureaucrats hoarded knowledge for power. Frontinus codified it for function. His legacy, then, is not carved in stone. It is piped quietly beneath our feet. Let's take one last look. The Book of Flow, Fronti's treatise, De Aqueductu Orbis Rami, is easily overlooked. Written in spare, unadorned Latin, it reads like an engineer's notebook charts, measurements, fault logs, and maintenance protocols. But that's exactly what makes it remarkable. In an empire known for rhetorical flourishes and sweeping histories, Frontinus's work stands out for its clarity of purpose. He wasn't trying to entertain, inspire, or even impress. He was trying to inform. He wanted future generations to inherit not a mystery, but a manual. And in doing so, he produced one of the earliest surviving examples of civil engineering literature. In Western history. Here are just a few of the things his treatise documents. The source of each aqueduct, including topographical maps. The incline of each conduit, some as precise as 1 meter drop per kilometer. Flow capacity calculations based on pipe size and gradient. Procedures for detecting illegal taps. Standards for materials, brick, stone, Concrete, maintenance intervals and job roles for aqueduct staff thought to modern eyes. This might resemble a civil infrastructure audit. To Rome, it was an instruction book for empire. Rome's quietest achievement, the Roman aqueducts are often admired for their arches, their height, grace, and endurance. But those arches, impressive as they are, only represent a fraction of the system. In truth, 80% of Rome's aqueducts were underground, carved through hills, tunneled beneath farms, threaded through the city's dense substructure. Rome's water network was invisible by design. That was part of its genius. Out of sight, protected from tampering, insulated from enemy attack, and resistant to evaporation, the system endured. Frontinus didn't build this network, but he protected it, and he made sure its invisible work could continue, uninterrupted, beyond the ambitions of any single official. What happened after he left? As often happens in history, Frontinus' success depended on his vigilance. After his departure, many of his reforms remained in place, at least for a time. Records show that future curators aquarum continued inspections, referenced his treatise, and even expanded on his documentation. But the pressures of empire wars, shifting emperors, economic strain began to erode the bureaucracy's attention. But by the 3rd century CE, the system was no longer being maintained as rigorously. Pipe theft returned. Maintenance intervals slipped. Records were misplaced or ignored. By the 4th century, some aqueducts had collapsed entirely, no longer flowing. By the 5th, invasions and internal strife disrupted even routine functions. And by the 6th century, during the Gothic Wars, Rome's aqueducts were deliberately used as siege tools against the very people they once served. Frontinus had given Rome a gift, but Rome, in time, forgot how to open it. A whisper beneath ruins, and yet, fragments of Frontinus' system endured. Even after the aqueducts were destroyed or abandoned, some pipes still held rainwater, slowly feeding small communities. Some fountains, fed by underground cisterns, continued to trickle. And the knowledge? The treatise survived. Monks and scribes in later centuries copied the Aqueductu, preserving its dry but vital pages. In the Renaissance, when engineers sought to rebuild the broken water systems of Italy, they turned to Frontinus, not poets or generals, but a bureaucrat with a measuring stick. And in 1453, Pope Nicholas V ordered repairs to the Aqua Virgo, one of the ancient aqueducts Frontinus had catalogued. That repaired aqueduct still flows today. Its final stop? The Trevi Fountain. What we learn it so. What does the story of Frontinus teach us? First, infrastructure matters. Not just at the moment of construction, but every day thereafter. Without attention, the most magnificent designs crumble. Second, bureaucracy, often dismissed as dull, is the operating system of civilization. Frontinus didn't fight wars or pen manifestos. He wrote maintenance protocols, and he preserved the city. Third, transparency matters. By naming names, auditing flows, and publishing findings, Frontinus tried to break cycles of corruption that had quietly taken hold. Fourth, knowledge must be passed on. When systems fail, it's often not because people didn't care, but because they didn't know what to do. Frontinus gave them the tools to know. A modern parallel in many modern cities. Water infrastructure now lies in a state of gradual neglect. Pipes corrode. Valves fail. Leaks go unreported. And like in Rome, most of it happens underground, out of sight, out of mind. Frontinus' story reminds us that invisible systems need visible care. That maintaining the flow of water, of electricity, of public trust is an active responsibility, not a passive benefit. And that sometimes the most important heroes of civilization are not warriors or rulers, but quiet administrators with notebooks. The final irony today, Frontinus is remembered mostly by historians, and civil engineers. Statues of emperors still stand, poets are still quoted, and generals are still glorified. But for anyone who has ever drunk from a municipal tap, flushed a public toilet, or walked past a gurgling fountain in a city square, you are, in some small way, the beneficiary of his legacy. Because long before infrastructure became a buzzword, Frontinus saw it for what it was, the foundation of a functioning world. And so, as we close this story, one final question remains. If a civilization can crumble because it forgets how its water flows, what else are we forgetting beneath our feet? You've probably heard the old saying, an army marches on its stomach. That quote is often attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte himself. Whether or not he actually said it, he certainly lived it. But how exactly did one of history's most famous military machines feed itself as it crisscrossed Europe, from the sunny fields of Italy to the freezing plains of Russia? Spoiler: poorly. This is the story of one of the least glamorous but most critical aspects of Napoleon's war machine, his food logistics. Specifically, how the army was fed, what they ate and didn't eat, and how the humble beans sometimes mattered more than the musket. It's not about glorious cavalry charges or battlefield strategy. It's about hardtack, rotting meat, desperate improvisation, and how it all shaped the fate of an empire. The basics. What did a French soldier eat? Let's start with the basics. In Napoleon's Grand Army, the typical daily ration, when available, looked something like this. Bread or biscuit, about 24 ounces. Meat, fresh or salted, about 16 ounces. Wine, a half-liter per day, was typical. A bit of salt, some legumes or rice, occasionally vinegar. Brandy or cheese. This might sound passable, maybe even decent, until you consider a few details. These rations were rarely delivered in full. Much of the meat was preserved poorly, or not at all. There was very little in the way of vitamins. Fresh vegetables were considered a luxury, and soldiers were often required to forage or buy extra food themselves. In short, the official ration was more like a wish list than a guarantee. Hardtack, the most boring bread in Europe when bread wasn't available, and it often wasn't soldiers a biscuit or hardtack. Hardtack was a type of dry, dense cracker made from flour and water. It was baked hard, often twice, to keep it from spoiling. The result was a piece of bread so tough it had to be soaked in water or wine to avoid breaking one's teeth. Hardtack could last for months or even years if kept dry, which was both its blessing and its curse. One soldier described it as eating a piece of roof tile soaked in tears. It became the foundation of military diets because it was cheap, transportable, and wouldn't rot. But it offered very little nutrition or satisfaction. The meat problem, the meat portion of the ration, was ideally fresh, but realistically salted or preserved. Salted meat, often beef or pork, was packed into barrels, then boiled in camp. In theory, this preserved the meat and gave soldiers protein. In practice, the meat often turned rancid in warm weather. Barrels leaked, and preservation was inconsistent. Worse yet, Napoleon's armies moved quickly. The more they marched, the harder it became to keep supplies aligned with the front. During the disastrous 1812 invasion of Russia, soldiers marched for days without seeing any meat at all. And when they did, it was sometimes horse meat freshly slaughtered after the animals collapsed from exhaustion. They boiled it in their helmets. They ate it raw. They sometimes fought over bones. Wine, salt, and vinegar wine was more than a luxury. It was medicinal, used to sterilize wounds, soften dry food, and hydrate when water was questionable. Wine was often more reliable than local rivers or wells. Salt, likewise, wasn't just for flavor. It was essential to prevent muscle cramps and maintain electrolyte balance. A lack of salt could lead to fatigue and illness. Vinegar, too, was valued, not for cooking, but for hygiene. Soldiers would rinse their feet in diluted vinegar to prevent infection and fungal problems. These were small details. Quiet supplies. Easy to overlook, but when they were missing, the cracks in the army began to show. The logistics nightmare feeding an army of 100,000 men or more across hundreds of miles of enemy territory was no small feat. Napoleon relied on a combination of three strategies: depots, pre-supplied storage points along known routes; foraging, soldiers, collecting food from local sources; requisition, taking food from villages, often by force. Depots worked best in friendly territory, but once the army moved into enemy lands, supply lines stretched thin. Foraging became critical, but also chaotic. Whole units were often delayed or disorganized while searching for food. Commanders had to choose between staying on the march or waiting for bread. Some soldiers turned to looting. Others starved. Requisitioning often turned locals against Napoleon's army, making resistance more likely and slowing progress. In the end, the enemy wasn't always the opposing army. It was hunger. Why didn't they just use canned food? Good question. And here's the interesting part. Napoleon actually encouraged food innovation. In 1795, he offered a cash prize to anyone who could develop a reliable way to preserve food. A man named Nicholas Appert eventually won it. He created a method of sealing food in glass jars, boiled and corked, much like wine. It was the beginning of modern canning, but there was a catch. Glass was heavy, breakable, not suited to the rough handling of war. And tin cans, though developed a few years later, required specialized openers and longer cooking times. Napoleon's armies were still using horses, carts, and raw muscle for movement. Canned food wouldn't become widespread in military use until decades later. So, yes, Napoleon helped inspire the invention of canned food, but it didn't help him in time. Starving in the snow. Russia, 1812. No discussion of Napoleon's logistics would be complete without addressing the catastrophic 1812 campaign in Russia. Napoleon entered Russia with over 600,000 men. By the time he retreated, fewer than 100,000 remained. Many were lost in battle, but even more were lost to hunger, disease, and exposure. As Russian forces retreated, they burned villages, fields, and granaries, leaving nothing for Napoleon's troops to forage. Even the few depots Napoleon had arranged were too small, too far apart, or poorly protected. Supply wagons were slow, and horses died by the thousands. Some soldiers resorted to eating their belts. Others died in the snow with biscuit crumbs in their pockets. The once glorious army dissolved into a starving, freezing procession. Napoleon's hubris and poor planning had collided with the sheer scale of geography. And food, or the lack of it, played a central role. The quiet lesson. So, what do we learn from this quiet history of beans, salt, and wine? That logistics is destiny. Strategy matters, but only if the troops are fed. That humble supplies, hardtack, salt, vinegar, are as important as bullets. That an army's stomach is less a metaphor than a daily crisis. That even in the age of brilliant generals, food remains the final measure of power. This was Napoleon's blind spot. He understood motion, momentum, morale. But he underestimated the quiet entropy of empty bellies. And as we'll see in the next section, even his imperial reforms, brilliant though they were, couldn't overcome a dinner that never arrived. And so we end this section with a simple question. If food wins wars more than firepower, why do we still glorify one and ignore the other? By now, you understand that feeding Napoleon's armies was not a matter of heroic inspiration, but a daily grind against spoilage, distance, and time. But what's less obvious, and quietly more interesting, is how those rations and routes actually shaped the map of Europe itself. Welcome to the silent, underappreciated history of military supply lines. The salted roads, crumbling depots, biscuit-laden wagons, and human mules that fed. A war machine across thousands of miles. It's a story about the geography of beans and the psychology of hunger. The train, not a locomotive, but a lifeline in Napoleonic military jargon. The train didn't mean a steam engine. It referred to the baggage and supply train, a sprawling, creaking network of wagons, oxen, carts, and laborers that followed the army. Some carried tents. Some carried tools. Most carried food. Every battalion had its assigned wagons and pack animals. But the further they traveled, the longer these trains grew and the more vulnerable they became. A moving army of 100,000 men required more than 2,000 wagons and over 30,000 draft animals. Not counting local suppliers or camp followers, each wagon could carry only so much, about 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of supplies. Divide that among rations for thousands of men, and the math becomes bleak. The supply train often extended for miles. It moved slowly, sometimes at less than 2 miles per hour. If the front of the army marched into battle, the back of the train might still be leaving the last village. You could literally starve while waiting for your own food to catch up. Wagons, roads, and whether Napoleon's armies didn't move on paved highways. They moved on dirt roads, mud paths, and rutted trails. In dry seasons, dust choked the wagons. In wet seasons, wheels sank into sludge. There are countless accounts of carts being abandoned, wheels breaking, horses collapsing from exhaustion or starvation themselves. In winter, wagons froze in place. In Russia, it got so cold that metal parts of carts cracked, axle grease congealed, bread froze solid. Soldiers had to thaw it with body heat before it was edible. Mud, dust, and ice became more powerful enemies than any Russian general. Beans and bureaucracy. To manage all this, Napoleon instituted a vast bureaucracy of quartermasters, commissaries, and administrators. They didn't fight battles, but they arguably determined whether battles could happen at all. They calculated daily rations, mapped depot routes, purchased livestock, arranged deliveries, and kept endless lists. Each division had a commissary officer who filed reports on the number of mouths to feed. They were responsible for balancing food stores against projected travel times. But bureaucracy moved slowly, especially in the 1800s, when communication relied on couriers and messengers. By the time a requisition for more salt pork made its way to Paris, and the shipment was arranged, and wagons were loaded, and the carts rolled forward, the army had already moved 50 miles ahead. Delays were constant. Mismatched records were frequent. Corruption was rampant. Food was sometimes lost along the way. And when that happened, soldiers simply went hungry. The human toll behind every lost wagon of beans was a human consequence. Diarrhea, dysentery, and malnutrition were constant threats. Soldiers would sometimes eat unripe crops or spoiled meat, leading to intestinal infections. Scurvy caused by a lack of vitamin C was common on long campaigns. Gums would swell, teeth would loosen, old wounds would reopen. Even when rations were available, they were hard to digest under stress. A soldier marching 15 to 20 miles a day burned thousands of calories. But a few ounces of biscuit and boiled pork could only go so far. In Spain, during the Peninsular War, some French divisions lost up to a third of their men, not to combat, but to disease and starvation. It's not glorious, but it's real. Foraging and its discontents, Napoleon often preferred living off the land, that is, letting his armies forage. On paper, this seemed brilliant. It reduced supply lines and made the army faster. In practice, it had consequences. Soldiers dispersed, breaking formation to look for food. Local civilians were terrorized, causing resentment. Some areas had already been picked clean by previous armies. It created moral and discipline issues, looting, drunkenness, even mutiny. Worse, foraging slowed the army when it needed to move fastest. In 1805, on the march to Austerlitz, French forces had to stop for days near Brunn, now Bro in the Czech Republic, to let soldiers search the countryside for anything edible. Every hour spent foraging was an hour lost in maneuver. But when your choices are slow down or starve, there's not much of a debate. The role of women and civilians. Napoleon's army didn't march alone. Thousands of civilians, many of them women, followed the army as part of the supply ecosystem. These were the cantiniers and vivandiers, women licensed to sell food and drink to troops. They also cooked, washed clothes, and sometimes cared for the sick. Some of them drove wagons. Others brought their own livestock. They were not officially soldiers, but their presence was expected. They made a little profit. They offered a sense of home. And in a strange way, they became mobile villages that traveled alongside war. But even they suffered from the same shortages. Many cantiniers froze to death during the retreat from Russia. Others were abandoned, left to walk for days without shelter or food. Their names are mostly lost to history, but their role was crucial. The salt roads of empire consider this. In order to salt its meat, the Grand Army needed massive quantities of salt. Salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was preservation. Without it, meat rotted in days. So Napoleon's government invested in enormous salt works across France and annexed salt-producing regions like Salzburg and parts of northern Italy. Salt became a strategic commodity. This led to the militarization of salt routes patrolled by soldiers, used exclusively for moving barrels of salt. One French general reportedly said, "We fight for glory, but we march for salt." In some ways, the very expansion of the Napoleonic Empire was driven by food logistics. Control the salt, and you controlled the meals. Control the meals, and you controlled the army. Food wasn't just a supply. It was infrastructure. When maps lied, Napoleon was famous for his use of maps and planning. But even the best maps couldn't tell him what he most needed to know: what food was available. Many military maps of the time showed topography, rivers, roads, but not crops, livestock herds, or seasonal harvest. So Napoleon's officers relied on travelers' reports, outdated census figures, and hasty estimates. Sometimes these reports were wildly optimistic. A village marked as having 200 cattle might have already been emptied by the last passing army. A granary noted on a 1798 report might have burned in 1802. There was no Google Maps, no satellites, no real-time updates. So armies would arrive hungry, only to find empty barns and locked cellars. And then they'd move on hungrier than before. When the empire's gut turned on itself by 1810, Napoleon controlled most of Western and Central Europe, but his empire was stretched thin, not just militarily, but nutritionally. Bread riots broke out in cities like Paris and Lyon. Rural regions suffered from over-requisitioning. Salt became so scarce that smuggling rose sharply. Napoleon responded with more bureaucracy, more rules, more inspectors, more seizures. But this only deepened resentment. The empire's gut had started to reject its own demands. And when Napoleon's armies faltered in Spain and collapsed in Russia, the entire system unraveled. Not because he lost the will to fight, but because his soldiers had nothing left to eat. So we arrive at an awkward but essential truth. No matter how brilliant your battle plan is, it won't matter if your soldiers are chewing leather belts and boiling snow for soup. And yet, this part of history is so often ignored. We celebrate the battlefield. We ignore the breadline. But ask yourself this: was Napoleon's genius in maneuver or in managing menus? You now understand that Napoleon's armies ran not just on ambition and artillery, but on beans, salt, and a vast web of creaking wagons, overwhelmed clerks, and hungry men. In Section 2, We trace the arteries of that system, the salted roads, fragile bureaucracies, and often invisible women who help move food through war. Now, in Section 3, we confront the end of that story. What happens when a system built to feed millions begins to starve itself? Let's walk slowly into the quiet undoing of an empire, one stale biscuit at a time. The Spain problem. Guerrilla warfare and empty barns by the early 1800s. Napoleon had turned his eyes towards Spain, a move that historians often label a strategic overreach. But from a food logistics standpoint, it was far worse. Spain was vast, mountainous, and agriculturally inconsistent. While rich in terrain, its food production was decentralized and seasonally limited. There were no centralized depots, no willing municipalities, no reliable maps of supply. Worse still, the Spanish people resisted, not just on the battlefield, but in the fields, villages, and cellars where food was hidden, destroyed, or poisoned. French soldiers reported finding empty pantries, scorched barns, and dried up wells. Locals abandoned farms, took livestock into the hills, or booby-trapped their own granaries. The term guerrilla warfare originated here, not just because of the fighting style, but because of its scale. The entire countryside turned against the French. Napoleon's army had expected to forage its way through Spain. Instead, it starved in place. Starvation Mars. Surviving on wild grass. Eyewitness accounts from the peninsula. War described long march with no supplies. French soldiers ate boiled grass, tree bark, and even the leather from their own gear. A corporal in the 31st Line Regiment recalled his unit resorting to eating candle wax, boot leather, and glue scraped from saddles. One officer noted, "Men dropped not from bullets, but from their own knees failing." We were quieter than ever. It takes effort to complain when you are starving. Some turn to desperate measures. There are scattered reports, contested by some historians, of cannibalism among isolated regiments. More often, soldiers simply died without drama. They would stop, sit, and not rise again. They weren't defeated by Spanish rifles. They were defeated by logistics. Russia, where the system imploded, the Spanish campaign frayed the supply system. But it was the Russian campaign of 1812 that broke it. Let's revisit what you likely already know, but slowly and with focus on the ordinary. Napoleon entered Russia with nearly 600,000 men. That's not a typo. 600,000. He had over 180,000 horses. He brought thousands of wagons. He expected to live off the land, with some resupply wagons trailing the army and depots set up along the way. But Russia did something unexpected. It withdrew. The Russian army retreated without fighting, drawing Napoleon deeper into the country and deeper into a food desert. Villages were abandoned. Fields were burned. Livestock was driven away. The strategy was deliberate. A scorched earth campaign. By the time Napoleon reached Smolensk, many of his men had been without full rations for weeks. By the time he reached Moscow, the city had been largely emptied and set on fire. There were no stores, no stockpiles, nothing to seize, and the cold was coming. Winter rations. Biscuit dust and snow when winter struck in Russia. It wasn't sudden. It was brutal and indifferent. Temperatures dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius, minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Wagons froze to roads. Horses died by the tens of thousands. Without horses, the wagons were abandoned. Without wagons, the food was abandoned. Without food, you see the pattern. Soldiers carried hardtack biscuits in pouches, but they often crumbled into dust from weeks of jostling and damp. That dust was eaten as gruel, mixed with snow or animal fat if available. Meat was long gone. Beans were rare. The joke among soldiers was that they would kill for a turnip. A few foraged from frozen potato fields. Others ate horse meat. First those that died, then those killed for food. Napoleon ordered emergency rations from depots in Vilnius and Minsk, but the roads were blocked, couriers lost, supplies overrun. Entire units collapsed from malnutrition. Of the 600,000 men who entered Russia, only about 100,000 left. The rest were dead, captured, or missing. It remains one of the greatest losses of life due to failed logistics in modern history. The emotional collapse wasn't just bodies that gave out. Morale was pulverized. Soldiers began to question everything, not just leadership, but the meaning of the war itself. A Polish infantryman wrote, "My fingers were black, my rations gone, and I saw a priest boiling his own boots." We no longer marched for France. We marched for meat. Units stopped obeying orders. Discipline collapsed. Officers abandoned troops. Horses trampled sleeping men. Some tried to surrender, even when there were no enemies around. Others wandered off in delirium. It was, as one historian put it, a famine with flags and Napoleon? He left the army mid-retreat and returned to Paris, attempting to salvage what political power he had left. His soldiers trudged on, alone. What about the salt? Remember the salt we talked about in Section 2? It failed too. Supply lines from French-controlled salt works were too long to sustain the Russian campaign. Much of the salted meat spoiled en route due to improper packing or stolen barrels. By the time soldiers received their rations, they were often mush, mold, or bones. And as the army retreated, salt became more valuable than silver. A small sack of salt, once meant for an entire platoon, could be bartered for a week's worth of bread. But by then, there was nothing left to preserve. The soldiers were preserving themselves through silence, movement, and bitter endurance. The hidden survivors, while most histories focus on the men who died, there's another side worth noting. Those who lived. These were men who adapted, quickly and ruthlessly. Some learned to dig for frozen roots. Others scavenged off dead comrades. A few even used battlefield debris, broken swords, musket barrels, to cook makeshift soups from scraps. These men didn't survive by luck. They survived by learning fast, trusting no one, and avoiding idealism. They understood something critical. The war wasn't about glory. It was about calories. Post-Russia. A crippled supply machine after the Russian disaster. Napoleon's army never recovered its logistical capacity. His later campaigns, including the ill-fated 100 Days, suffered from rushed supplies, poor organization, and inadequate provisioning. The empire was hungry in more ways than one, for victory, for food, and for stability. But it couldn't feed itself. Even in the final days before Waterloo, Napoleon's officers were scrambling for bread deliveries. Some units arrived at the battlefield already fatigued from hunger. When they lost, it wasn't just a tactical failure. It was the end of a long, slow hunger. The legacy of Napoleonic logistics. What did all of this mean? Oddly enough, Napoleon's failures laid the groundwork for modern military logistics. Nations began to recognize that food was as strategic as ammunition. This led to the development of military rail systems, improved preservation techniques like canned food, later developed in the early 19th century, standardized rations and ration cards, the emergence of professional logistics, officers in modern armies. It also changed how wars were planned. Napoleon may have marched for glory, but future generals mapped out grain depots before troop movements. Food came first. In the end, silence. There's something humbling about this. Part of history. Not because it's grand or dramatic, but because it's so quiet. No battles, no glory. Just boots in snow, spoons scraping empty pots, and the soft shuffle of men too weak to speak. They say an army marches on its stomach. That they forget that when the stomach empties, the war ends quietly, slowly, and without fanfare. So, The next time you read about Austerlitz or Leipzig, about marshals and maneuvers, ask yourself, what were they eating that morning? And what did they eat the next?